I'll let you know when it's live. There it is. All right, Ashton, it's all yours.
Or I had to look for the unmute button. Can you see it? Let me see if I can
I'm
make
not
it.
sure.
How about now?
That's my.
You can see it?
Looks good.
Cool. Okay, so lecture 12, we're continuing to deepen this approach of integrating the human form with the cosmic movements. And in the beginning of the chapter, so in the last chapter, Diner emphasizes these two, the polarity of radius and sphere. And now he's working in the lemniscate more deeply and describes this what he comes up with, or what he's presenting, the morphological approach, as a system that works, or I guess that is informed or dynamized by these three forces, which he insists aren't to be thought of abstractly, but are very much concrete. And so, yeah. So he leads us through, as he does in other lectures, in this cycle and many others, of course, through a kind of imaginative exercise, this time with what he's describing as the mobile lemniscate. Real quick, I can't see my mouse. Sorry. Yeah, so he guides us through imagining the metamorphosis of the lemniscate going up and down the human organism. And so he writes, we simply have to imagine that what is widened with regard to space. So he's talking here about the rib cage and the vertebra connected to them, regard to space when matter is attenuated, as it were, in the pair of the ribs. I mean, those which close via the sternum is balanced out in the vertebra via the compression of the matter. So I thought we could kind of walk through this a bit together. So as I understand it, at the top of the lemniscate, that's the vertebra, or a representation of the vertebra. And then with the widening out of the lemniscate, we have the rib cage, and where it kind of drops out into nothing to be connected by the sternum. So then he guides the audience to imagine the lemniscate moving upward, where he says we find the vertebra, as it were, bulged out into a wide cavity, which I take to be the cavity of the cranium, while the remaining branches of the lemniscate seem to vanish, nestling away, so to speak, in the internal formative process, becoming hidden and undefined. What is all going on there, I can't say, but so this is the image, the figure that he has for the movement of the lemniscate up to the extreme of the sphere. And then going downward, from the middle portion, we contemplate, for instance, the attachment of the lower limbs to the pelvis. In all that opens downward from this point, we find the other half of the loop fading away, while those portions which disappear as you go toward the head are prolonged, in that they join up with the radial principle, as it were. And so this will become relevant, especially once we start looking at the connections that he draws with the movements of the planets in the Ptolemaic solar system. So first he begins by talking about Venus and Mercury, but I'm going to talk about the superior planets as he describes them. And this was new to me, even though I've been interested in astrology in a long time, to discover that, roughly speaking, Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars, whenever they go into retrograde, are always somewhere kind of close to being in an opposition with the sun. And that's geocentric. So like from our point of view on Earth, you can see that when these planets go retrograde, the Earth is between the sun and the planet. And so they'll never make, as far as I tried to see if this has ever been the case. I don't think it is. It must be impossible. But I couldn't find a single, I guess, moment in history where one of these planets would be making a conjunction to astrologically to the sun as it was going retrograde. So anyway, so imagine just like dynamically that when these planets, I think as he says, when they're closest to the Earth, I guess, and going through their retrograde, making their loops, that they're furthest away from the sun, making an opposition to it. And so he says that the loops as loops will be most active and influential, and he'll make a contrast between that characteristic and that of Mercury and Venus. And so he connects this to the sphere forming process of the head. And then just to show this representation again, hold on real quick. My mouse has disappeared, so it's making it hard to navigate. All right. Hold on just a second. Matt, can you stop my screen share so I can just modify something real quick? Cool. There we go. Okay, sorry about that. So then to connect this with this morphological image, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn must be related to each other because their spheres correspond to one another right where they proceed to form loops. So he says this loop forming process is especially, he identifies it with the sphere forming process, or where it's expressing itself. Whereas in contrast, Mercury and Venus, when they make their retrograde movements, they're between the sun and the Earth, and they also end up disappearing once they actually make their conjunctions. In contrast to the outer planets, at least in the Ptolemaic system, when they which make oppositions, when they make their conjunctions, they disappear into the sun, and that's how I understand Steiner when he's connecting this with the way that there's something that like the ribs with the sternum, that there's a diminishing, and at that extreme of the limbs, there's a diminishing. I'm connecting that with the fact that Venus and Mercury disappear into the sun when they're making their loops. But anyway, I'll share this. Quote, "The movements of Venus and Mercury will somehow find expression in the opposite pole of the human constitution, opposite to the forming of the head, what deparallelizes itself from the spherical formation and makes itself parallel to the radial formation, where the one part of the limnoscate diminishes and the other grows into the limbs, as it were, into a purely radial development." So he says because Venus and Mercury are, with the sun, basically, when they're making their loops, he says that they in a sense reinforce the sun, the dynamic influence of the sun, which he'll say eventually we'll see is essentially radial. And so they are enhancing that radial activity, whereas the outer planets, Jupiter, Saturn, Mars, they're opposing that and exercising something, well, the opposite polarity, the sphere. So what closes in the orbit of Venus no longer closes in its effects. Rather, it runs out in something like parabolic branches in a way that corresponds to just what we see in the human limbs, where the vertebrae form gradually diminishes. So again, yeah, I'm connecting this with Venus and Mercury disappearing into the sun, but maybe one of you has another idea about that. And so we have these extremes of Mercury and Venus and then the superior planets. And Steiner describes the sun as the kind of rhythmic system correspondence between them. So yeah, a kind of mediator. And then he goes on to say that what's distinct about the movement of the sun and the moon in connection with, I guess, in comparison to the limniscatory movements of the planets is the fact that they don't make loops. And so, and then he says, he connects the movement of the moon, which in a monthly lunar cycle moves around the Earth, versus the sun in its annual movement sort of goes up and down. And so he connects this with the moon, with the vertical axis of the animal, and says, if we really want to understand the morphological distinctions between humans and animals, we have to go beyond the Earth. So yes, identifies the horizontal spinal axis of the animal with the moon and the vertical axis with the sun. And so again, that's connected with this identifying of the solar influence with the radial. What corresponds to the line and direction of the spine in the human being is related to the sun's path. So here you see the kind of up and down movement. So right now, at least in the northern hemisphere, as we push towards the winter solstice, the sun is sinking in the sky, is related to the sun's path. We must surely relate the sun's path itself to something that coincides in some way with the Earth's radius. We must see, and then here comes the maybe the more controversial claim. I don't know if it's so controversial today, but he at least made pains to, I guess, insist that he wasn't actually being controversial, as we'll see. We must see the Earth as moving in such a way that many of her radii coincide with the sun's path. Yeah, so, and then he goes on to say, there is no way that the Earth can be said to revolve around the sun based on this consideration, this morphological consideration. But if you take seriously the morphological descriptions, what can be read out of the human form itself, you will see that the Earth in some sense follows the sun. You will see that, and this is the image that, or the figure that he drew, that the sun races on ahead, as it were, and the Earth follows behind it. This must then be the essence of the matter. The earthly and the solar orbit in some way coincide, and the Earth somehow follows the sun, making it possible for the Earth's radii to fall into the solar path. So maybe some of you are familiar with the calendar of the soul, and in that book of 52 verses, there's 4 that are called light verses, and they supposedly correspond with these 4 moments. There's 4 moments apparently. I guess maybe 4 weeks in the year that the Earth is moving in, as he's describing, into this place where the sun once was in its movement. And he describes this in other lectures as well, but it's very interesting. And he is at pains to say that he's not trying to catalyze any kind of astronomical revolution, but pointing out that, and as he has in other lectures, there's limitations to the calculative approach, and that it's possible. And I'm not an astronomer, so I don't know this for sure, but he claims it's possible that these various calculations, for example, like calculating the movement of the Earth around the sun from our position on Earth as the inverse of what we see happening, what we see the sun doing in the sky throughout the year. And then in addition to that, other calculations to refine the picture, that he describes that as a resultant, and that it's possible to come up with other resultants, including this one that he is also claiming is more consistent because, or perhaps more compelling because of the connection with this morphological picture that he's been building, where we can integrate the human gestalt with the movements of the planets. And then he says, emphasizing the limits of calculation, that if we really want to get more precise about this, we need to our method needs to look to the terrestrial beings. And then he starts going into the reductionist linear perspective of evolution, and this compulsion to try and derive, like the kingdoms of nature, starting with the mineral and then building up from there. But he says you can't actually you can't possibly derive the process of animal formation by imagining a linear extension of the process of plant formation, but instead that they're kind of inverses of each other, especially when we look at the process of assimilation, where the plant and its relationship with carbon and oxygen portrays this upbuilding process, whereas the animal portrays this unforming process. So anyway, Matt, did you want to say anything about these last couple points? I have another slide describing Steiner, this mention of the human as a kind of lagging behind the animal in the sort of inverse of the plant marching in its extreme toward mineralization. But there's also some reference to a more mathematical way of understanding this, and maybe you have some thoughts about that.
I think you said it. I mean, just the human has this neotenous movement in the sense that we're born premature, you could say, relative to the animals at an earlier stage of embryonic development. And so we're more plastic. And, I think even a neo-Darwinian biologist wouldn't say that humans are somehow just a linear development of plants. We might share a common ancestor, they would say. But I think Steiner was pointing more to the sort of common person's understanding of evolution, that, life somehow sprang from matter, and that the plant form is the simplest, and animals are an elaboration on that, and humans just a kind of elaboration on animals. And that's a kind of, if you were to want to create a geometric relationship, it wouldn't be a line. And that there is an interesting correspondence, though, I would say, between plants and humans that Plato points out in the Timaeus, right? That humans are kind of upside down plants. And I think that has something to do with the more intense relationship that both plants and humans have with the sun in comparison to animals, which, as Steiner points out, are more morphologically in resonance with the moon. But in terms of this point at the top of that angle, the bent line that Steiner draws for us, Steiner sort of leaves that with a question mark, at least in this lecture. And I was thinking that might be something like the cell, which has this spherical shape that corresponds to the sphere of the cosmos itself, of the heavenly macrocosm, and that in some sense all life is if there's an archetype, an earth form of life, it would be the cell, and plants, animals, and humans are a morphological development of that. And as Steiner would suggest, the mineral world is sort of an excretion of the living world rather than the origin of it. But yeah, that's all I would add there.
Great. Well, who's up? What do y'all think?
Can I also want to share my screen quickly to show the retrograde movements and try to picture what you were describing, Ashton, using Archetypal Explorer. Can you all see this?
Yeah.
So this is the current time, and each planet, including the three outer planets, is shown.
It's a little blurry, Matt. Maybe you could.
Is it?
Maybe you could maximize it or something a little bit, like magnify.
It started to correct. I think it's like a time, like a lag.
Yeah.
Let me see if I zoom in a little bit. Does that help?
Yeah.
So just as we move forward in time, you can kind of compare the heliocentric on the left versus the geocentric on the right, and see when we only get one retrograde, I think, of Mars here towards the end of this cycle. But if you track, like if you look at Venus when it's conjunct the sun and closest to the Earth on the left side here, and how that corresponds to the retrograde motion from the geocentric perspective, it kind of gives you some hint. and you can see Mercury. And you can, as you watch the geocentric view, you can, it seems almost, I mean, in retrospect, obvious that Mercury and Venus are in some special relationship to the sun, as they seem to wobble back and forth around the sun. But in any event, one thing that's wrong with this view that I just wanted to point out here, the geocentric view is ordered from inside out based on the distance from the Earth. This generally works except when a planet travels behind the sun relative to Earth, as seen properly from the heliocentric view. Properly, I mean, well, we could question that. The geocentric chart renders the apparent order incorrectly because the planet will still appear as if in front of the sun. So just wanted to point that out. There's always a limitation in these attempts to diagram something that's not quite as geometrical as we might wish it to be. Hopefully that was helpful. Go ahead, Bart.
I had just a question about kind of the lemniscate path that Steiner says that the planets kind of take. Now, that's not saying that they take a lemniscate path around the sun. That's kind of, we see it as a lemniscate from our perspective.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, part of what I take Steiner to be trying to do with a kind of Goethean approach to astronomy, right, is to take the phenomena seriously, meaning what do we actually perceive? And he's pointing out that, we do have to take the Copernican point that the Earth is moving seriously. And we just hadn't been aware of that as a possible perception before. And we can become aware of that and factor that into what we would perceive if we imagined that the Earth was stationary and just the heavens were moving. But so he's not just reverting to the geocentric perspective. He's like, it's geocentrism plus in a way, like rather than negating the geocentric view in light of Copernicus, he's saying, okay, yes, the Earth is moving. We have to factor that movement in, but can we experience that? The Earth's movement, right? Is this how others would read what Steiner's trying to do? Like, right? But we want to take seriously the appearances and not just imagine that our conjecture of a heliocentric model of the solar system is true and that our experience is just a delusion or an illusion of some kind. Go ahead, Karsten.
Yeah, I read in one of Whitehead's book that he talked about you can be provincial in time as well as in space. And so I think also what Steiner is trying to do is to expand our view of what's going on in time, to include all the different, say, stages of consciousness in the full picture, and in this way to overcome this provincialism in time. That I think that's a very good expression.
Yep. Thanks, Karsten. Lorenzo, I'm glad, Karsten, not to be the only one always bringing Whitehead in, so thank you. Lorenzo?
Yeah, I just wanted to think about the sun's movement too, because of course the sun is moving in the geocentric model, but we now, even in the heliocentric model, think that the sun is moving around the center of the galaxy, or maybe some other intermediary mass. And I think that Steiner here is talking about the movement of the sun and the Earth following it from the phenomenological point of view. But I was wondering if anybody of you knows if at the time it was already clear that the sun was moving relative to the galaxy, and if Steiner is somehow conflating these two aspects, the phenomenological movement of the sun and let's say the relative movement of the sun in respect of the galaxy, because the two arguments are kind of similar when he draws the continuous lemniscate like arabesque. We can think, I think that we today tend to think it as the sun moving around the center of the galaxy, and so even if the Earth, if the sun were to stay still, the Earth would have orbited around the sun. Since the sun is actually moving, then we can see this, we can picture this idea of the Earth that is following the sun in a quite rational way. But I'm not sure if what Steiner meant is so easy. Maybe he wasn't actually talking about the movement of the sun relative to the center of the galaxy, but he was just really mixing the apparent motion, phenomenological motion of the sun, and the heliocentric model. What's your opinion? Was it already known historically? Like, I think that this is something that Hubble studied, but at the moment I don't know the chronology perfectly. Yeah, that was it.
I think it was known that the Earth, or that the solar system, the sun, was moving towards a particular constellation in Steiner's time, but I'm trying to remember when. It was relatively late in the 20th century when we even recognized that we were in a galaxy, and that the nebula, as they were called, that we would observe were other galaxies. And so I think to say that Steiner knew about the galactic supposed rotation of the revolution of the sun around the center, I don't think was established at that point. But when we look at like the image that Angus shared of the so-called helical model that you're describing, Lorenzo, this came up earlier, that to watch that happen, we're situated somewhere in space, like a floating head, floating eyeball or something, and motion is relative, right? And so to take that sort of static view of just an eyeball watching the sun go by is totally abstract and arbitrary. I mean, for one thing, most of those videos I've seen of the helical model don't show the sun also having a waveform in its movement. It's always just in a straight line. And I think that lemniscate pattern that Steiner's describing would be even more accurate. But again, it's like the Earth's motion, which is where we're perceiving the sun from, and the sun's motion. We can't step outside of our earthly human embodiment and the perspective generated that in order to know the true movement. And I see Ali's comment. Maybe Ali can clarify. I wasn't trying to make that opposition between real and apparent. I was saying we need to kind of overcome it, just to clarify. But yeah, I think the helical model is neat. I find it quite compelling, but I don't think that that's exactly what Steiner was trying to gesture towards either. Yeah.
So
I don't know. Yeah.
His lecture that I would reference when I talked about this, these light verses in the calendar of the soul. It's from GA 171, Inner Impulses of Evolution, where he's talking about the sun's actual movement in cosmic space. Not sure, he's not referencing necessarily any orbiting of, I guess what the contemporary astronomers talk about, but he says, so there is a point, he says, in the cosmos where the sun and the earth are both together, but not at the same time, when the sun is there on its path, or rather has left this point by a quarter of its path. So he goes on, I'll link to it, but I don't know if that addresses the riddle at all, but, well, not decisively or finally, of course, but yeah.
Did you want to chime in, Allie, about the real apparent movement question? No? Okay. I agree with what you've put in the chat. Alex, go ahead.
Yeah, I was thinking a little bit about how on one hand it's really interesting to try and follow these celestial movements, and personally I find it quite difficult to picture them fully in detail. I guess, just as Steiner says, we really need to look into it in more detail. But one thing that's been also interesting to sort of that I've been getting from these lectures is that he's always making this correspondence or correlation between the movements, or shall we say forces, in the celestial bodies, and the movements or forces in the formative forces in human beings, and he speaks of animals and plants. And I go back a little bit to my biodynamic training, where it was very interesting to just observe and there personally, to witness, I would say. I was going to say to observe in detail, but at least I witnessed how the movements of, especially the sun, because that's quite obvious. They correlate very well, or with what is happening in plant life. So I think that what for me is interesting as well in these series of lectures is that Steiner is trying to reveal what I think I've previously said, that some sort of astral laws or astral forces that are hidden, and that they sort of become apparent in these movements that he brings attention to. Not to say that what he's bringing attention to, the movements that we see in the celestial bodies, are the lemniscates that become apparent in the formative forces in the rib cage and the vertebra, are the astral forces themselves, but they become apparent there. And to say that there's a correlation between the human body and these and the formative forces and the movements of the celestial bodies, for me it means that there's a unifying sort of law of astral forces that influences all physical phenomena. And instead of a direct influence of planets upon life on Earth. So I think for me, that's also an interesting aspect. It goes a little bit back, I think, to this comment of Ali that what happens on Earth has a direct relationship with what happens on the cosmos, maybe at a physical level, but also more deeply at an astral level. And that's something that is revealed more and more as we go through these lectures.
Thanks, Alex.
Thanks, Alex.
I was just thinking of what Karsten mentioned earlier about the provincializing provincial time and integrating more of our being. And also, like what Steiner mentioned in the last lecture about this sort of self-similarity between embryogenesis at an individual level and the development of the Earth, and that it seems like this morphogenetic action is at work during embryogenesis, but it comes to a halt at a certain point, and then I guess, as you were describing, there's more of a kind of interior. Yeah, I guess there's many layers. But Matt, did you want to say something?
Well, just that I appreciate the point Alex is making that archetypal astrologers also make, that it's not like the planetary movements and alignments and rhythms are causing things to happen on Earth, but rather that they're an indication of a deeper archetypal reality that is at work on Earth as in heaven. And so it's more about that indication of the archetypal process under play, and we can see the mirroring as above so below, but this isn't the planets emanating or raining down and sort of shaping the bodies of the human form. It's more that the gestalt of the human form is it's just mirrored by what's going on in heaven. Yeah. Hey, Chad.
Good morning. Yeah, I totally agree with that. It's not a causal relationship. It's a more of an entangled process that everything breathes together, as Plotinus says, that Rick mentions a lot. I have this question. I remember at the end he brings in the idea of an ideal point. Do you guys remember that? Is like at the very end, and it seemed like there was a schematic. I'm just listening to the audio, so I was curious if he had a graphic for it, and just generally what y'all's interpretation of the ideal point, or what he may be intimating towards that. It was right towards the end. I think he's leading towards the next lecture potentially, but
I think that was. Go ahead, Ashton.
It was on the last page. With this, wasn't directly being connected with this image, but it was just after he mentioned it.
Yeah, I think the ideal point he was talking about was the angle, above where plant and animal meet at that angle, which I'm trying to find exactly what he says about that. But I don't know that he was. I mean, this probably has some kind of astronomical correspondence.
He said in the next lecture, I think they'll go more into this ideal point.
Right. Yeah, so if we want to represent the kingdoms of nature schematically, we have to do so in such a way that we begin with some ideal point from which the realms of plants and animals extend themselves after bifurcation. And then we have to extend the lines, but we have to extend the line corresponding to the plant kingdom such that it becomes longer as it's extended, and on the other hand, shorten the line representing animals as we extend it. He says this is a thoroughly mathematical concept.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, and
I
he
was
just asked the
thinking,
question, what in reality corresponds to the ideal point in our diagram? Um, and he says we'll reflect on that in the next lecture.
I'll wait and see. Go ahead, Karsten.
Yeah, I was just thinking about something I read about Goethe, that he was criticized when he was trying to describe this archetypical plant. He was criticized for taking the, say, higher level species as the model and not previous forms. So he took kind of the plant in an where the plantness in was had the highest degree of expression, you could say, and he used that to understand the lower forms. So I was thinking about that when I read this part in Steiner, that it's like, what does it mean to be a man? Perhaps we have to understand, what does Christ consciousness mean, to understand the kind of the level we're at right now. So we need these ideal forms, the full expression of any kind of archetype, to understand the more say modest expressions. So that was what I was thinking.
Yeah, I was actually hoping that that was more of his in idea behind it, that it was more of an archetypal aspiration moving towards the ideal. I'm just in general, I thought it was interesting about just that the sun and the moon are the two kind of core parts of one's identity in the archetypal astrological perspective, and how the sun and the moon are the only two bodies that don't retrograde, and there's a certain, you know, solidity to them as far as in gestation there's not a potential for them to slow down and you know do these oppositions or these interior conjunctions. And I was thinking about how it's Mars, Saturn, and Jupiter that they're doing the opposition. I was thinking about the solar limnoscape he's describing as like a vertical kind of relationship, whereas the moon is more of radial. Is that right? So like, it's interesting that the moon in the lunar dimension of our being is the relational part of our being. It's doing this kind of radial, horizontal function, whereas the sun it's more directional. I mean, not necessarily vertical in a spiritual sense, but it does correspond to the trajectory of one's life, to the will, to the action, to the, you know, our direction. Whereas the moon, lunar, is all encompassing, and it's kind of surrounding. I mean, the solar is radial in its energy, but there's more of a directional kind of will associated with it. So then I was thinking about how Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn have more to do with like structure. Saturn, like the bones, and it has the opposition. Jupiter is about growth, it's expansion. Mars has again a yang energy, an assertive masculine tendency, whereas Venus and Mercury's similar to the moon in that it's about the mind and communication, information exchange. It's very relational as well. It's also mythically the only god that went into the underworld and back and forth. But at Venus, I wasn't as clear on, but it has more to do with aesthetics and sensual beauty, but it's more of a sensing kind of, also yin. So it's interesting. The moon is yin, Mercury is yin, Venus is yin. I mean, Mercury, I guess, is ambiguous, but definitely has a loosening, you know, relational quality. Whereas Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn, it's more of a growth. It's more outwardly vector. So it's just interesting as far as the body is developing embryogenically, how the relationship between Mercury and Venus and the sun have more like extension to the limbs, and that tactile, that's Mercury is the fingers connection that way. And then Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn is more like skeletal, structural building, and the oppositions that they do. Anyway, there's just some analogies I was taking away.
Very cool. Thanks, Chad. I like that. Lorenzo, go ahead.
Yeah, I'd like to expand a little on something that was touched on the introduction, but that we haven't talked about. That is that the idea that maybe, I think so, when Steiner is saying that the morphogenesis of man has a retrograde, let's say, motion from the animal, and this, the last images that we saw, that the split between plant and animal, and then while from the plant a direct motion goes on to the mineral, while we have this inverse motion from the animal and man. And I see there an intuition of what is called now neoteny. Is that a word?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, fertilization. And that's an incredibly interesting field and concept in itself, because the idea that we, since we are, let's say that evolution is working with us in this strange way, that it's not actually pushing forward the characteristics. And I'm speaking now from a Darwinian point of view. Let's take for a moment Darwin as our hypothesis, that man is not just developing the characteristics of monkeys, but that on the contrary, what we observe is that it's like we are getting higher resolution image, let's say, of a frame that was placed somewhere in the process of the embryogenesis of the monkey, so that each step that we find in fossils, that those hypotheticals connections between monkeys and man, what we see is that we more and more we expand characteristics of what was an immature form of monkey. And this kind of expands the idea of time from, a linear progress, because you can think that, of course, we are not just monkeys, fetuses. There is an evolution, but the evolution, the growth, is carried out from, let's say, a different possibility. It's like we branched out from the monkey at a moment that was in the embryogenesis of the monkey, not the final moment. And this apparently has been going on for mutation after mutation after mutation, so much so that we are kind of reaching a limit, because the relative size of the head of the newborn human is, just slightly smaller than it permits the mother to survive. But we are on the brink of a species where every birth is so dangerous, that this is obviously a very something that is very strange, that evolution in a Darwinian sense took up on. We are taking on us an enormous danger to get this very strange shape that we have, and this is very looks unnatural. There are lots of ancient astronauts theory that use this fact to say that we were actually artificially engineered. But I would like to point rather to the fact that if we assume, as mainstream science does, that there are complex forces that just with the natural evolution work in this very complex manner that brings a species to the brink of self-destruction just to maximize certain characteristics is indistinguishable from an external event. What I'm trying to say is that complexity is indistinguishable sometimes from conscious process, and that this reversal of time has very much to do with function, something that we think that only conscious beings can cause, because it goes against the laws of thermodynamics, and so it's just food for thought. But I think that sometimes, people that speak about ancient astronauts are actually a bit too prosaic, and maybe they do not imagine that the most interesting thing is that actually the three-body problem already in itself has something as that looks unnatural as the aspects of human evolution they point to.
Yeah, thanks, Lorenzo. Very interesting. I also wonder to what extent this diagram Steiner gives us of the relationship of the various kingdoms can be connected with the fall. Because I've always thought of, in terms of this ideal point that he leaves us with at the end of this lecture, it seems like the plant is more unambiguous in its praise of the sun, let us say, whereas it seems that animals are in some way fallen away from that light source, and humans are attempting to return to it, but out of freedom rather than just out of sort of design, you might say, of the plants, that they can't help but worship the sun and orient towards the light, whereas humans can have to choose freely whether to do that or not. Wait until lecture 17 for that. Oh, the three suns. Okay. The three suns was, interesting. That even contemporary astronomers make use in their models of these three suns as ancient astronomers had. I didn't know about that before.
Okay.
I'm curious, Matt, do you know about the neoteny, and is it even, I think I remember seeing like a Nova or Discovery or something about how it's even the DNA or the sequencing, or like, I think it was something to do with the time, the length of time that certain functions are on or off as the fetus is developing, that regulates like finger growth, for example, and that like it actually shuts off earlier, I think, if I'm not, it's like it rather, whereas like there's more sequences possible in the creation of our digits, for example, or that like there's more DNA to unfold or something in potential, but it shuts off earlier, and that's what cuts off our finger growth. I could be totally off, but I was wondering if you knew in your research, because you've been researching.
I'm not sure about that in terms of like gene regulatory networks in the developmental process. shutting off earlier, but I mean that would be an example of neoteny if that's part of what they're finding. That, like, in other words, our digits, our hands are underdeveloped relative to other animals that have claws and hooves and so on.
Right, right.
We don't specialize in that way.
Hmm. Yeah, sorry, I'm so I don't have a clear grasp of it, but yeah, it made sense resonant wise to all of the neotenous understanding.
Yeah. Interdisciplinarity or transdisciplinarity even is not an easy task. So we're all doing our best to approach basic understanding of multiple disciplines that even on their own take a lifetime to master.
I'm still kind of thinking about what Lorenzo was speaking about in relation to the human head and childbirth and evolution and that in I guess simultaneously happening with the planet becoming the habitability of the planet becoming questionable, and just all the chaos that is happening around the world at the same time. That's also counterintuitive to I guess really simple portrayals of evolution, that a species would end up in a situation like that, if the preservation of life is the most important aspect, physical life.
That's where I think I referenced before. I think it's helpful to understand it as a birth process in the Graphian sense, and that the same thing happened for the fetus when the womb was too, no longer large enough to hold the growth of the fetus, that it was taking too many resources from the womb that were no longer enough for it, that it had to break out of that confining situation. And it does seem like there's a metaphor there for the growth of the human species and the number of us in this extraction of resources from the earth and the environmental contractions. But it's hopefully a death rebirth process, that there's some other form of life or a way of recognizing the human after we go through this bottleneck limiting situation, and figure out a new relationship to the earth that's sustainable rather than exploitively unsustainable. Give some thoughts. I mean, what I actually think is so much of it is, I think, pointing to what Steiner is really wanting us to do, is to connect with the archetypal world, with the spirit world, and to move into relationship with it, to see beyond the material world and no longer get hung up on it as primary, which is why we're destroying the environment ultimately, because we see the world as lumber, minerals, things to exploit, to extract, rather than the sacred dimension of them, which, if we could switch, would help form a sustainable relationship.
Yeah, absolutely. I also think, he's trying to clue us into the way in which, like, yeah, if we think of matter as like the source of life and what's really real out there, that's Maya, that's an illusion. But he also has this incarnational view that if we look at the physical sort of world that appears to our physical senses, if we look at it the right way, it's more like, especially the heavens, it's more like our womb. It's a matrix. Matter is the matrix out of which spirit is coming into birth of, in a new way, which is why we're even involved in all of this.
Right.
It's not a mistake. And so like, yeah, matter is an illusion in one way, but in another way, it's like embodiment, incarnation is the whole point.
Yeah.
Mhm. Well, I've got to run to my next meeting, but yeah, looking forward to lecture 13. If anyone wants to summarize it for us next week, let us know.